Well, welcome back to our little Tuesday thoughts and our follow-up on our issue we talked about last week with some yellow pivot corners and trying to diagnose that deficiency symptom. So today we've got our results from a soil samples and our tissue samples. So we're going to go over those and take a look and try to illustrate how we're going to use these reports to diagnose the problem and maybe some ideas on how to fix it. Okay. So here we have our results from our samples. We have our pivot corner and our under the pivot. We can see, nitrogen is looking good on the pivot corner. In general, fertility is okay, except for sulfur here. You see sulfur is way down to 0.10, which falls in the deficient category. So definitely a sulfur problem. Now what makes this even worse is if we look at the nitrogen to sulfur ratio. We divide sulfur 4.289 by the 0.10 sulfur content, and we get a nitrogen to sulfur ratio of approximately 39 to 1. Now normal NDS ratios should fall somewhere of 16 to 1, and generally when you get above, anything above 20 to 1 is going to cause some deficiency symptoms with sulfur. So sulfur is definitely the culprit here. Now what's interesting is if we look at under the pivot, we see we have low nitrogen, even though that crop looked good and green, and the low sulfur still, but since they're much more in balance, 3.294 divided by 0.163, here's our nitrogen to sulfur ratio of 20 to 1, which is on that limit of starting to be a concern, but obviously much better than the 39 to 1 ratio under the corners. Now, on the soil test itself, we see that sulfur values, Malek 3 sulfur ICAP, are both pretty low. In fact, the pivot is actually a little bit lower than the corners. But what is probably causing the corners to be so bad is the fact that we had that extra high nitrogen content. Now, in the future, to correct this problem, just looking at the pivot and the shelter that the irrigation motor was under, we saw the color change on it, so we know there's probably high sulfur in the water. So as soon as they start irrigating, there'll be plenty of sulfur to solve the problem there. But on the dry laying corners, probably looking at needing to go ahead and maybe side dress some thiosulfate, or maybe a low broadcast rate of some ammonium sulfate dry to correct that issue. But stay tuned for later in the summer. We'll follow up with this and go get a water sample from that well and look at the sulfur content in the water. So once again, thanks guys for tuning in today, and we'll talk to you in the future.